So admittedly, I haven't actually finished this video. It's only 3 minutes long. Stumbled across it kind of accidentally on Twitter, courtesy of CRER, which is an anti-racist organisation that works with the Scottish Government. Relatively prevalent in terms of longevity, but not really an institution that gets that much attention when it's all said and done. But the minute I seen the term white supremacy coming up on the screen, I knew that I had to start recording, and it kind of plays into other things that I'd intended at some point to make videos on in the anti-racist sphere, shall we say. But right off the jump, it initially references 50 years of racial equality legislation in Scotland, right? And of course, that would suggest that things have been put in place over the years to ensure that there can be no discrimination when it comes to the basis of race, when it comes to things such as employment, etc., etc. But we're not dealing with equality at this point, the same way we're not dealing with the term racist or racism anymore. These individuals, for the longest time, and it's not limited to this institution, it's something I've said on a multitude of occasions prior to this, these people are taking words and redefining them. And effectively, they're unchallenged. They essentially live in an echo chamber, and it allows them to bounce ideas off each other that become more and more radical as the years go on. And because they remain relatively unchallenged, it allows them to then implement policy based on the things that they're bouncing off one another. But the reality of the matter is, the words that they are redefining, it's opportunistic, it's malevolent, and above all else, it's fucking nonsense, it has to be said. You've got equality. The same way the feminists in this day and age still preach to the heavens about the requirement for gender equality. We haven't achieved true gender equality, despite the fact there is not one thing in this country that hinders women in any way. There's not one thing in this country that prevents women from doing something that a man can do, and vice versa. Gender equality was achieved a long time ago, the same way as racial equality was achieved. But as I said, we're not dealing with equality anymore. We're dealing with equity. The same way as we're not dealing with racism anymore. We're dealing with a newly fine-tuned variation of racism, as these people have taken the term and expanded it. So if you open up the dictionary, the term that you will see inside the definition, that's null and void. The thing that I find the most irritating about that is the fact that they will use words of old and install them in their 21st century narratives. But yet, people that read that or hear that or see that, immediately in their heads, they will instinctively refer back to the original definition. Unbeknownst to them, it's been redefined. Of course, as I've said, racial inequality or equality, we're talking about equity. More needs to be done. Representation, disparities, things to that effect. There's not enough black people in Parliament. That's racial inequality. How do we stop that? How do we eradicate that? How do we achieve equality? Well, we force in blacks into Parliament. Equity. And then when we talk about racism, well, that's no longer looking at a group of individuals and seeing them as beneath you, treating them differently or worse off, seeing them as subordinates, purely on the basis of racial characteristics. Oh, no. Now, in this day and age, it's the system itself. It's society. It's the structures, it's oppression, etc., etc., giving them the justification to attack society, deconstruct it and reconstruct it in a more equitable, racially just manner. But as for white supremacy, you're just talking fucking nonsense. Absolute nonsense. As the years go on and this bollocks accelerates more and more and more, they're just taking more and more from American universities and college campuses and copying and pasting it straight into Scotland. You know, white supremacy. in Scotland. Here we go. Well, this will be good. And of course, they've said that they're working with museums. And one of the things that they're looking at is white supremacy. And then they define it to a certain extent by saying that it centres white institutions and decision makers. Oh, white supremacy in Scotland, you know. God forbid. This is what they do. They occasionally will point to things that are ordinarily natural, you know. Tribalism, or in this instance, ethnocentrism. Or white supremacy that centres white institutions and decision makers. So the assumption being that we prioritise or give preferential treatment to institutions, businesses, companies, if they're white, if they appear white, if the company is historically white, if the makeup of the country is white, the same as we will do with decision makers. We will shaft the BAMEs, we will shaft black companies. Cultural, political, economic. Oh, this will be good, I can't wait. It also says that everyday racism. Everyday racism. But again, ordinarily, the individual might genuinely think back to the word of old in the dictionary, the word they were taught all about in school. But the reality of the matter is, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about inequity. We're talking about when things don't go their way. We're talking about not getting the job. We're talking about microaggressions. Yes, microaggressions is an ironic term that these people have adopted in order to proclaim that they are consistently the victims of racism. Everyday racism. Define it. Prove it. I'd love you to, but they can't. They say that racism manifests over time. It's manifested in different directions. It always changes as society changes and modernises. Very convenient. Also as well, it says black and other visibly racialised peoples. Racialised, of course, is hearkening to critical race theory, because one of the core principles of critical race theory will have you believe that the idea of race is just pseudoscience, essentially. White people created the term back in the day so they could justify enslaving BAMEs. So racialised is aka, you know, that's the people that we racialised when we created race and just gave them the identity of race. And then it says as well, it reinforces the inequalities they face. Inequalities is another word that's essentially been redefined, because what they essentially mean is inequity or equity. Disparities, again. Whenever they refer to inequality, by and large, it tends to mean disparities. Oh, racial equality is rife in the Scottish police force. Oh, what do you mean? Whatever could you mean? Well, look at all the white police chiefs in comparison to the black police chiefs. There's a disparity there. That's inequality. How do we render that? How do we achieve equality? How do we level the playing field? How do we split the balance? Well, we need to implement equitable policies in order to achieve equality on paper. Cultural superiority. Ideas of cultural superiority are entrenched within society. Now, I'm not entirely sure, as I said, because I've not really watched it this far in. I'm not entirely sure if they're going to expand on this, elaborate, give us a definition as to what they mean, or if we're just expected to speculate. But if I was to give my 2 cents prior to finding out one way or the other, I would say that even if that was to be believed, this is again an example of them pointing at things that are intrinsically normal. Naturally, you would assume in Scotland, the same way you would assume in any other country, that we would assume our own culture to be prioritised in some manner. That doesn't necessarily mean that we see our culture as superior to other cultures, but it's Scotland, therefore we will prioritise our culture. Why would we prioritise a Kenyan culture? Or an Afghan culture? Or any other culture for that matter? We would prioritise our own. But as I said, I don't know where they're going to go with this. Oh, white privilege. White privilege and complicity can be seen in people's attitudes and behaviour. White privilege. Fucking unbelievable. Oh, wow. And it's just fascinating how these anti-racist types, you know, they've got the sixth sense. They've got the wisdom and the literature. They are fucking powerhouses in all things high IQ. And they can see the complicity. They can see the unconscious bias that we reek of. They can see how our behaviours and our attitudes are steeped in white privilege. Things that we can't see ourselves. The same way that they can see how our society is structured in such a manner that prioritises our culture, renders it supreme, etc., etc. All things that we can't see ourselves. It's remarkable. Truly is a gift. Fuck. Oh, don't joke, man. It can be seen on a social level in how people talk to each other. And I love this as well. It says primary school down here. You know, make no mistake, there's always an element of targeting the youth. This is brilliant. So white privilege can be seen on a social level in how people talk to each other. Okay, right, okay. The same white privilege can also be seen in how organisations make decisions and conduct their business. And then we get a little image here that says, don't need to think about whiteness unless anti-racist. Being silent shields racism. Oh, God. Fucking unbelievable, you know. Unbelievable. I'll even know what to say. Of course you can. White fragility. This is what I find again fascinating. How they seem to put us under the microscope as if we're being treated like we are lab rats, guinea pigs. And again, the same way that they've got this big brain analysis, these hot takes, you know, the powerhouses in their field. The sixth sense where they can see things that we can't see. They've also got terms for what to label us as when we inevitably react. White fragility, you know. Because apparently we're fragile when these individuals start talking this nonsense. You're just fragile. The irony, the absolute irony of being called fragile by individuals who cry and whine and moan and complain about microaggressions and racism on a daily basis and expect a never-ending fucking tsunami of sympathy. A system, they will deny there is a problem. Oh, of course. I love it. And they've got it all figured out. They will deny there's a problem. Nah, if they've got any IQ points to hold for their own, they'll probably deny the premise that's been put forth by these opportunistic wankers who redefine words and try to peddle a narrative that is in fact incorrect. There is nothing within society that you can point to that suggests that BAMEs, purely for being BAME, are held back in any capacity. The video fucking begun by explicitly stating that there's been at least 50 odd years of racial equality legislation. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that even in the 1991 census, 98.7%, 74% sorry, of the populace in Scotland was considered white. In the 2001 census, it was roughly 98% or 97%. And then, of course, in the 2011 census, it was 96% white. So by and large, for the longest of time, Scotland has been near enough exclusively white. But yet, despite all of that, there was still legislation put in place for the minuscule minority. But now we're in a day and age where these opportunistic people are taking the concepts of disparities and proclaiming that they exist because of racial discrimination, oppression, and then the way that they will prove this or the way that they will get their point across is by redefining words. It's opportunism at its fucking core. Defensive, resist change. Oh, they resist change. They get defensive. I wonder why. Okay. Look at this. This is what I'm talking about. Disparities, essentially. Once we explored these concepts, we identified how white supremacy shows up in museums. And the first example that they give, all staff are white. All the staff in museums are white. Is there a policy in place that these people can point to, that anybody can point to, that explicitly states that non-whites cannot apply to be in museums? No, there's not. Again, I refer you back to what they mentioned themselves at the very beginning of the video. Racial equality legislation. They then go on to say that decision making is centered on whiteness. Decision making is centered on whiteness, so people that come together to make decisions in a museum setting do so on the basis of whiteness. Whiteness is exclusively the topic. Whiteness is on everybody's mind. Whiteness is a concept that these people have made up themselves. Because even if we take the notion, the insinuation that we created race and it's not got any basis in science, by and large, we don't live by the concepts of whiteness today. For better or for worse, whiteness is a term that these individuals use to attack, and effectively it's a scapegoat in order for them to masquerade their anti-white fucking bile. No, decision making centred on whiteness, and what should it be centred on then? As if that's an issue in Scotland that is white. How dare Scottish decision makers base their decisions or centre their decisions on their whiteness, quote unquote. And then says that museums benefit from historic wealth and white donors with strong colonial links. Oh my god, and even if that was to be believed, and even if that was 100% truthful, how the fuck does that in any shape or form indicate or play into the notion of white supremacy? The same question can be applied to how does decision making based on quote unquote whiteness play into this concept of white supremacy? How does a museum that's exclusively white in terms of its staff play into the concept of white supremacy? So in order to eradicate white supremacy, do we need to diversify the staff of the museum? The knowledge and experience of people of colour have been erased or ignored. Oh yeah, of course it has. Of course it has. Yep, that's what we've done. We've just erased your existence from our history. You know, we've completely whitewashed our history in order to pretend that you were never part of it, really, for any length of time. White voices and expertise are prioritised, and we can't be having that. So in order to tackle this white supremacy issue that they're insisting exists, which is that of white voices and expertise being prioritised in Scotland, oh my god, the audacity, the temerity, we need to prioritise BAMEs. Again, it's inequality because allegedly white voices and expertise are prioritised purely on the basis that they are white voices and they have expertise. That's apparently an indication of inequality. So in order to achieve equality, in order to render or eradicate this evil, this sin, we need to prioritise BAMEs. We need to do the polar opposite of what they're insisting exists, essentially. And then it says that museums benefit from historic wealth and white donors with strong colonial links. Well, I've already read that out. Other voices are erased or ignored. Oh, fuck off. There is a lack of transparency. Oh, well, that's pretty vague. That's pretty damn vague. Collections are seen through a white lens. That's white supremacy at its finest, guys. Wow, they've really got us now. You pesky museums. For the longest time, you've had it all your own way. You know, there is a lot of box ticking, which is ironic because that's essentially what you individuals are trying to implement yourselves. But they then have the temerity to go, oh, but we don't want it to be tokenistic. Oh, what the fuck else is it going to be? Oh, and there it is, the lack of representation. So not everybody is represented, and due to that lack of representation, that's a clear indication of white supremacy. A white audience reinforces the status quo. A white audience. Oh my god. And there it is. The end result is that museums are in a position of power. Ah, I love the way that these people they define power. For example, courtesy of the anti-racist educator, the definition of power that this post will focus on is that which comes as a result of consent rather than coercion. This is what various thinkers have described as a more important and long-lasting form of power than that which holds a gun to your head. Usually, we think of power as something that is explicit, visible, verifiable. Think of a police officer patrolling the streets, a politician closing the border to people from outside, or a teacher telling a student they're in detention. These examples are obvious and would stop people doing things they may otherwise do. However, instead of simply trying to stop people doing things, this form of power, referring to the paragraph above regarding this is what various thinkers have described as the more important and long-lasting form of power. This form of power exists without explicit threats and instead seeks to construct a view of what a normal world is. It insists on a false rationality where the normal is sold as the result of common sense, rather than the outcome of a system where the voice of some, quite simply, counts for more than somebody else's. There is only one normal, and not any number of them depending on time and place. Think, for example, of beauty standards, where those racialised as white are upheld as more beautiful than those racialised as non-whites. It's not rational in any sense, but it is a largely agreed upon fact. Okay. From that flows a whole series of actions by people, those with power and those without, to change according to this norm, or be disciplined or not adhering to it. This kind of power creates an ideal subject and seeks to encourage a correct population. In the case of racism, we can see that in the form of whiteness, but can also be looked at a patriarchy, structural barriers for people with disabilities, or violence against trans folk. One way in which this normalising mundane power is different from the repressive in-your-face kind is that we can't definitively say where it comes from. That's convenient. There is no authority that can be emailed and appealed to change to subsequently better the lot of those at the bottom. This power is multi-pronged, cannot be seen, very convenient, and the blame cannot be pinned on any one person, authority, organisation, or group of people. How convenient. The activity which ensures apprenticeship and the acquisition of aptitudes of types of behaviour is developed there by means of a whole assembly of regulated communications, lessons, questions and answers, orders, coded signs of obedience, differentiation marks of the value, or of each person, the levels of knowledge, and by the means of a whole series of power processes. It goes on a little bit. The idea of power is hugely complex, and as such this glossary post did not examine it in its necessary detail. Well, I will just put it into layman's terms as I've seen it elsewhere on a multitude of occasions. Essentially what they're trying to indicate when they talk about power is that if the country of Scotland in this instance has a parliament that's predominantly white, and every CEO or the majority of CEOs are white, bankers are white, police chiefs are white, every position of power is held near enough if not exclusively by whites or Scottish people. That then by extension means that they have power as a group, as a collective, and that expands itself onto the wider populace, the white majority. The whites within the population all by extension have power because the majority of positions of power in the country are held by whites. That's essentially what it means. Yeah? Despite the fact it's total bullshit. But that's what they claim. And then again, it gives them justification to then start trying to obtain power for themselves in order to level that playing field. Yeah? Parliament needs to be more BAME in order for them to have power. So the only thing that I can really take from that definition when it comes to applying it to a museum, I would assume, I assume they're going to give us the cushy high IQ, big brained analysis and what they really mean by this. But if I had to guess prior to pressing play, I would assume that because of everything they listed regarding museums and the fact that they're near enough exclusively white, all the staff are white and they base their decisions on a centre around whiteness, etc, etc. It's almost exclusively a white institution. That therefore kind of gives them the green light to start insinuating that museums are in a position of power. There it is. Equity. It's kind of going full circle now because all the things I talked about at the beginning of the video pertaining to redefined words and what they really mean when it comes to things such as equality, equity, and power. Share power. Work with equity. Oh, wow. Be open. Be honest. Because, currently the white supremacists, they lie every day. Be transparent. They're not being transparent, and that's very white supremacist in nature. Recognise that racism is a legacy of slavery and colonialism, and here they go again. Here they go again. Because one of the clever little things that they've got going, and this isn't limited to this video, this is something that I see all too fucking often, is that due to the fact that they've redefined words and they'll point to disparities and racial inequalities as a result of said disparities, they will then go back to the days of slavery and colonialism, and they will look at the attitudes that persisted back then, those racist attitudes. They will then in turn say that those racist attitudes that existed back then still exist today, and if you need the proof, they can provide the proof, and they will point to said disparities, or in this instance, white staff in a fucking museum. Create opportunities. Give them opportunities that they ordinarily have, because there's already legislation in place to ensure that they cannot be prevented from having these opportunities. But we need to give them additional opportunities. Power. It is again. Creating discomfort. You know, they always talk about discomfort as if they're smashing that glass ceiling, as if, you know, this is them on their journey towards liberation, revolution, creating discomfort, you know. The days of fighting off microaggressions are behind them now, and it's all about reversing those trends and creating discomfort, shock to the system. And just creating discomfort or curating discomfort is the first step on this journey. Oh yeah. Oh wow. So essentially you've managed to conclude a 3-minute odd video with the proverbial waffle that we've come to expect from all these fucking whack jobs and non-entities and opportunists. You've concluded it on the same sort of shit that every other video concludes, or every other PDF concludes, every other anti-racist educational resource concludes. Equity, demands, more being done, prioritisation, preferential treatment, power. Oh, fucking Jesus. Wow. Yeah, white supremacy is such a rampant issue within Scotland. We're not even allowed. What's fucking mind? You know? Our national identity's been eradicated day in, day out by our governments, by our institutions, and essentially, depending on what we say, if we speak out, or if we try to create political parties, etc., predicated on the notions of ethno-nationalism, ethnocentrism, etc., we run no risk of being in serious doo-doo, thanks to Happy Hamza and his hate crime bill, etc. Yeah. White supremacy is such a rampant issue. What changes could you make to be an anti-racist in your own social relationships? What a load of redacted. What a load of shite.